Hello, and thank you for having me today. My name is Renee Delauter, and I am the Deputy to the Cannabis Program here at AOAC. Today, I will be discussing the current cannabis testing legislation and testing changes in the United States. I will also talk about the hemp testing as it pertains to the USDA's final rule. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about AOAC and what we do. Typically, I'm asked three things about AOAC and general accreditation. What does AOAC do? What is ISO IEC 17025 accreditation, and what allows us to accredit labs? So let me start by explaining who we are and what we do. American Association for Laboratory Accreditation, or AOAC, is an accreditation body in the United States. We are an organization that provides accreditation services, which is a third-party recognition of competence to perform specific tasks, such as laboratory testing. We are among the largest accreditation body in the U.S. and one of the largest in the world. Currently, there are over 3,800 certificates in the Directory of Accredited Organizations. What is ISO IEC 17025 accreditation? ISO IEC 17025 accreditation is a standard used for testing and calibration laboratories. Laboratories that get assessed to this include food and beverage labs, environmental labs, and cannabis labs. ISO IEC 17025 enables laboratories to demonstrate that they operate competently and generate valid results, thereby promoting confidence in their work, both nationally and around the world. This accreditation also helps laboratories by generating wider acceptance of results between countries. Test reports and certificates can be accepted from one country to another without the need for further testing, which in turn improves international trade. Why can we assess and accredit? As an accreditation body, we are full members of AOAC and signatories of the Mutual Recognition Agreement. Accreditation bodies that are signatories of the AOAC MRA have been peer evaluated in accordance with the requirements of ISO IEC 17011 to demonstrate their competence. So we also are held to a standard to be able to assess and accredit laboratories. Now that I've given you some background on what we do, I'll go ahead and jump into the United States Cannabis Regulations. I just wanted to start by giving a brief overview of where our country stands by providing a breakdown of each state's legal status when it comes to cannabis. Cannabis does include both hemp and marijuana, but for the purpose of this presentation, it can be considered high THC cannabis. Currently, 16 states have legalized high THC cannabis for recreational use. These states are the blue states shown on the map. This includes Oregon, Washington State, California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Montana, South Dakota, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and Alaska. The darker green states are states which have legalized medical use cannabis. Many of these states have a list of medical conditions that qualify patients for medical use cannabis. The light green states have legal medical use cannabis but still limited THC. This would be your hemp and your CBD products. The states that have the red letter D on them are the states that have decriminalized cannabis. This is not the same as legalization. The states that have decriminalized cannabis typically have a legal limit. For instance, Maryland, you can possess up to 10 grams of cannabis with no penalty, but with possession of more than 10 grams includes fines and potential jail time. On the flip side, the United States is a lot more friendly towards hemp cultivation and sales occurring in their states. Currently, the only state that does not allow for hemp to be cultivated is Idaho. Additionally, Washington, D.C. and the United States territories also do not allow hemp to be grown. Some of these states have their own hemp plans approved by the USDA, whereas some states do not have anything in place yet requiring testing. I will talk more about the USDA final rule on a later slide. So despite the pandemic, 2020 was a rather successful year in the cannabis industry. Both Hawaii and Ohio decriminalized cannabis. Hawaii's possession limit is now 3 grams, being the smallest legal limit in the U.S. And Ohio has doubled the amount of cannabis considered a misdemeanor from 100 to 200 grams. Vermont legalized recreational use cannabis, becoming the 11th state to legalize, tax, and regulate recreational cannabis. And Arizona and Oklahoma passed legislation requiring testing for cannabis products. Continuing with successes in the industry, during the 2020 election, there were 5 states that had cannabis regulations on their ballots. All 5 states passed their proposed legislation. Arizona, Montana, and New Jersey passed legalization for adult use cannabis. Mississippi passed legalization for medical use cannabis, and South Dakota passed both legalization of medical and adult use. Many of you probably heard these 5 states pass some sort of legalization during the 2020 election, so I wanted to provide a brief update on each of these states and where they are in the process of legalization. The state of Arizona waited no time at all to release adult use regulations. Arizona Department of Health Services, who oversees the medical program and who will now oversee the adult use program, is now accepting applications from existing medical cannabis license holders seeking to operate in the adult use market. The state of New Jersey has officially signed their bill into law, and they are now working on license requirements for growers, distributors, testing laboratories, and other requirements for testing labs. Currently, New Jersey does not require laboratories to be ISO IEC 17225 accredited for medical marijuana testing, so it'll be interesting to see if it becomes a requirement for recreational use laboratories. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, Montana and South Dakota, things haven't gone so smoothly. Opponents to legalization in all 3 states have filed lawsuits challenging the voter-approved laws on procedural grounds. Many states did not have the time or resources to move forward with ballot initiatives due to the pandemic and state shutdowns. However, some states are pursuing legalization because of the pandemic. Both Connecticut and Pennsylvania have been pushing for legalization for recreational use cannabis to create revenue and jobs in their states. One study conducted by the Connecticut Center of Economic Analysis suggested that Connecticut could create 10,000 to 17,000 jobs and $690 to $740 million in state tax revenue over 5 years of sales. Cannabis legalization measures are already off to a great start for 2021. There are already at least 8 states this year that have bills pushing for some sort of cannabis legalization, including both Connecticut and Pennsylvania. Other states that have begun 2021 initiatives include Maryland, Nebraska, New Mexico, North Dakota, Virginia, and Wyoming. I want to dive a little bit deeper into what each state's initiative looks like. Connecticut has introduced Bill SB 888. This will legalize and regulate adult use cannabis. The bill is expected to move forward with amendments, but there have been no formal proposed amendments yet. Maryland has introduced HB 32. This bill will legalize and regulate adult use cannabis. From what it looks like, this bill is in the Judiciary Committee with no amendments formally proposed yet. Nebraska received enough signatures in 2020 to put medical marijuana on the 2020 ballot. However, Nebraska Supreme Court stripped the medical marijuana constitutional amendment from the 2020 ballot due to the question being confusing and creating voter doubt, and that it violated the single subject requirement of a constitutional question. Nebraskans for medical marijuana have submitted a new petition for 2022, and the signature drive will start in the spring of 21. In the meantime, the bill LB 474 was introduced to legalize medical cannabis through the Nebraska unicameral legislature. In February, New Mexico House of Representatives approved a bill to legalize cannabis for adult use. Now the Senate will work to unify 3 competing bills. In 2020, North Dakota did not receive enough signatures to get legalization for adult use on the ballot, but they are trying again this year. They will need to get enough signatures to put this on the 2022 ballot. Meanwhile, lawmakers in North Dakota are pushing for further reduced harsh and senseless penalties for adults caught with small amounts of marijuana. In Pennsylvania, for the first time, a bipartisan pair of senators have introduced a bill that would legalize cannabis for adult use. The bill has not been formally introduced, but this would allow adults 21 and older to purchase and possess cannabis from licensed realtors. Virginia House and Senate voted to approve a final compromise on the adult use legislation bill. This is now waiting on the governor's approval. Both possession and cultivation of cannabis will not become legal for adults until January 1st, 2024. In Wyoming, HB 0209 was assigned on March 2nd. This bill would legalize possession, homegrown, and sales for adults, as well as establish a regulatory framework for licensing, tracking, and taxation. Here are some states that are predicted to have cannabis legislation on the 2022 ballot. Arkansas, Florida, Missouri, Ohio, and Oklahoma are predicted to have adult use cannabis on their ballots, and Idaho is predicted to have medical use cannabis on their ballot. One thing to note here is that all the states that are potentially going to have adult use cannabis on their 2022 ballot all require ISO IEC 17025 accreditation for their medical programs. I did want to spend a minute on Washington, D.C. and their initiative for legalization, as it is unique. The initiative is called Initiative 71. This would legalize cannabis and allow D.C. to tax and regulate the industry. Because D.C. is not a state and is considered federal property, they do not tax and regulate as states do. This has made it more difficult to pass cannabis legislation due to cannabis being federally illegal. In this case, Congress must vote on legalization, and it has been turned down continuously. So what do the current testing requirements look like in the U.S.? There are currently no federal testing requirements for cannabis. Each state is in charge of making their own regulations and requirements, but testing is not always required. Some requirements for cannabis include being accredited to ISO IEC 17025 by an ILAC-recognized accreditation body. I want to emphasize why ILAC-recognized accreditation body is important to note. As I mentioned in my introduction about A2LA, we as an accrediting body have requirements we have to meet as well. This way, there is a competent accreditation body assessing appropriate requirements for testing labs. Other requirements include required tests such as pesticides, potencies, heavy metal, and microbials, and the limits of detection for each test required to pass. License is also required. Some states require labs to hold a state license to test cannabis as well. I want to expand on states requiring ISO IEC 17025 accreditation. Many people want to know, why is this important? Like I mentioned, there are no federal regulations for cannabis currently in the U.S., so with each state making their own regulation, ISO IEC 17025 accreditation brings some standardization to the cannabis testing industry. I want to highlight the ISO IEC 17025 accreditation specifically because there are many other accreditations out there. ISO IEC 17025 accreditation is recognized internationally and builds off the quality requirements for ISO 9001, but adds technical competency requirements for labs. This is super important for cannabis labs considering there are very few standard methods for testing cannabis. There are sections in the standard that require complete validations. Labs need not only the complete method validations, but authorization of staff to be able to validate these methods, evidence of training, passing proficiency tests, and that's just to name a few elements required. Other significant areas of the standard include competency requirements of personnel and sampling requirements for labs. So why are states leaning towards third-party ISO accreditation? Legalization is still very new in the United States, and many states don't have the resources to self-regulate this industry appropriately. Because this is such a new industry, states have put regulations in place that they have later found were not appropriate or sufficient for this industry. ISO IEC 17025 is a worldwide known standard that many other industries use for regulations. Having a standard to follow helps build confidence in the cannabis industry. So why would customers, such as growers, dispensaries, and consumers, want testing requirements? It helps to minimize risk. ISO IEC 17025 accreditation helps ensure test results are accurate and enhances customers' trust in the tested product by assuring them that it has been thoroughly evaluated by an independent, competent testing laboratory that has been assessed by a third party. This is only a handful of states, but I wanted to highlight a few states to show the variation of testing requirements from state to state. Arizona, Oklahoma, and Texas have not required ISO IEC 17025 accreditation in the past, but are now adding this to their cannabis testing requirements. All three states are at different places of legalization as well. Arizona has legalized recreational use, Oklahoma legalized medical use only, and Texas has legalized CBD or hemp products only. As you can see, Alaska and Illinois are legal for recreational use, but neither require ISO accreditation. But states like Maine, Nevada, and now Vermont all have legalized recreational use cannabis and do require testing labs to have ISO IEC 17025 accreditation. New Jersey, Maryland, and Pennsylvania all have medical cannabis programs, but ISO IEC 17025 accreditation is not required in New Jersey, but is required in both Maryland and Pennsylvania. Like I mentioned, New Jersey has just passed legalization for recreational use, but there's still no requirements for ISO IEC 17025 accreditation yet. Oregon's pretty unique when it comes to testing cannabis. They have their own state accreditation program called ORLAB. ORLAB stands for Oregon Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, so they do not require cannabis labs to seek accreditation from an ILAC accreditation body. This program is what environmental labs in Oregon are assessed to. There's a little bit of controversy about this because they also make cannabis labs meet T&I requirements. For example, PT requirements are quite stringent compared to ISO requirements. T&I requires labs to do PT of their whole scope with all analytes included twice a year. This is very costly for labs that cannot receive federal funding. Most states do require some sort of testing and do have testing requirements, even if ISO IEC 17025 accreditation is not a requirement. I want to point out that in 2020, both Arizona and Oklahoma went from not requiring ISO IEC 17025 accreditation to requiring it. I want to expand on why testing is now required. Many states, including both Arizona and Oklahoma, legalized medical cannabis and didn't exactly know where to go from there. In Oklahoma, they legalized medical cannabis in 2018, but did not have any specific requirements in place for this. They later realized they needed to add specific testing requirements like heavy metals, microbials, mycotoxins, THC potency, and a few others, along with requiring ISO IEC 17025 accreditation. The ISO IEC 17025 standard is also easier to follow considering many other industries use this standard. You used to be able to get a license before accreditation. Now you must get accredited to get a state license. There are pros to cons in this. There are both pros and cons to this. A pro for requiring accreditation before testing or receiving a license is that laboratories are being assessed and being deemed competent before testing customer samples. Some cons for requiring accreditation before testing or receiving a license is cost. Most labs do not have revenue before they start testing, so this is a big upfront cost. Assessors are not viewing any customer-generated data, such as C of A's, since the laboratory is not actually testing. Also, the validations are not done with in-matrix samples, which could affect results. States tend to evolve testing requirements when they notice public health trends, such as recalls and illnesses. For example, in 2019, states started noticing that there were an increased number of people having respiratory complications due to vaping. After further investigation, they later found that vitamin E acetate was being used to cut vaping products. This test is now required testing in both Maryland and Michigan. As for recalls, this could happen if someone found mold or foreign matter in a product that has already gone to shelf. In some states, products are also required to be tested after they have been packaged and are already ready to purchase. This is due to contaminants such as microbials growing on the product due to poor packaging or storing. Oklahoma is just one state adopting the system. Several other states have revised their testing requirements in the past couple of years to require additional testing. California expanded the panel of required tests 3 times in 2018 alone. And Colorado now requires heavy metals, pesticides, and microbials to be tested. Okay, so now I'm going to move on from cannabis to the USDA hemp final rule. So what prompted the USDA to get involved? In the United States, the USDA regulates agricultural exports and goods, which now includes hemp. Hemp is now being cultivated for many purposes. In the U.S., including manufacturing CBD and CBG products. Some of the primary decisions made in this rule include DEA certification. This requirement means that all hemp testing labs must be registered with the DEA to test hemp. Labs have until December 31st, 2022 to get registered. This requirement is still unclear as some labs that are testing marijuana were previously DEA registered. Additional guidance is needed for labs that are testing both hemp and marijuana, as it is likely that they will need to pick one. The final rule establishes performance-based sampling requirements. States are given flexibility to achieve performance objectives that they desire, such as a reliability of 95%. Some states do require licensing and ISO accreditation for hemp testing and sampling. One state that does this is Colorado. Samples must be collected by a USDA approved sampling agent. The USDA will provide a list of authorized sampling agents on their website. Sampling agents must be trained under the applicable USDA or state training procedures. The requirements for testing total THC instead of limiting the testing to Delta 9 THC has also not been changed. Laboratories should meet the AOAC International Standard Method performance requirements for selecting an appropriate method to determine MU. They encourage states to monitor, review, and evaluate MU, determine trends and outliers, which may indicate quote-unquote lab shopping for higher MUs. Why is MU important? A sample could be borderline pass-fail, and MU could help determine if a sample needs to be retested or not. USDA is not adopting requirements that hemp testing laboratories must be approved under a USDA laboratory approval program or undergo ISO accreditation. State plans are free to include additional requirements for hemp testing laboratories, including ISO accreditation or other certifications. This decision was largely based on cost. To recap, the U.S. is slowly but surely making progress in legalization and regulation of cannabis testing. Although many states have pushed cannabis initiatives to a later date, it still looks promising for the future.